The Galactic Arbitration Nexus was the oldest structure still standing in known space, a station the size of a small continent that orbited a dying red star at the edge of the Perseus Arm. And every species that had ever waged war or signed a treaty knew its name like they knew the names of their own gods. It had been built 4,000 years ago by the Velithari, a species of tall and graceful beings whose skin was made of living crystal that shifted color with their emotions, and hummed with harmonic frequencies that carried meaning deeper than any spoken language could reach. From the very beginning, they had appointed themselves not as rulers, but as judges, not as conquerors, but as the keepers of balance between civilizations that would have torn each other apart without a neutral voice to hold the line. Arbitress Salith Vaughn stood at the center of the grand chamber and let the silence do its work before she spoke. She was 612 years old, which was middle-aged for a Velithari, and her crystalline skin glowed with a deep sapphire resonance that every species in the room recognized as the color of calm authority. And when she finally opened her mouth, her voice carried harmonics that settled into the bones of every listener, like a warm hand pressing gently on a racing heart. "The session will continue," she said, and every delegation in the chamber sat a little straighter. The dispute before her was not complicated in its facts, but it was dangerous in its politics, because the Crethon Dominion and the Menari Collective both claimed the same stretch of resource-rich space in the outer veil. And the Crethon were the kind of species that settled arguments with warships, while the Menari were the kind that settled arguments by merging their consciousness into a shared empathic field and hoping the other side would feel their sadness. The Crethon delegation sat on the left side of the chamber, reptilian warriors in ceremonial armor that did a poor job of hiding the combat plating underneath. And at their head sat Warlord Dresic, a scarred and thick-necked commander whose yellow eyes never blinked, and whose claws left scratches on the ancient stone table every time he shifted his weight. The Menari delegation floated on the right, a cluster of translucent beings that moved like jellyfish through air instead of water, their bodies pulsing with soft bioluminescent light that changed color with their emotional state. And right now, every single one of them was glowing a pale and trembling violet that meant fear. Salith studied both sides and kept her expression neutral, the way she had kept it neutral through 6 centuries of arguments that ranged from petty trade disputes to accusations of genocide. And she noted for the 3rd time that day that Warlord Drezic's legal arguments contained contradictions that no competent military strategist would accidentally. He was not stupid, she thought, which meant the contradictions were deliberate, which meant he wanted something other than a favorable ruling. She filed that observation away and turned her attention to the gallery. The observation tier above the chamber floor held representatives from dozens of species who had come to watch the proceedings. Ambassadors and journalists and scholars and spies, all mixed together in a crowd that smelled like 100 different atmospheres. And among them, sitting in the back row, in a chair that was slightly too large for his frame, was a human. Corporal Elias Wren was 31 years old, and had been assigned to the Arbitration Nexus as part of Earth's newly established diplomatic security detail, which was a fancy way of saying that the Galactic Council had allowed humanity to send one low-ranking soldier to sit in the gallery and watch how real civilizations handled their business. 40 years ago, and in the eyes of the galaxy, they were still essentially children, a species that had barely crawled out of their own atmosphere, and was now stumbling around the interstellar neighborhood, knocking on doors, and asking if anyone wanted to be friends, and most species treated them with the kind of polite condescension that adults reserve for toddlers who have just learned to tie their shoes. Elias did not seem to mind, or if he did, he never showed it. He was not a large man by any standard, human or alien, and he had the kind of face that people forgot 5 minutes after meeting him. Brown hair cut short, and brown eyes that sat quietly in a face that rarely smiled and never frowned. And he wore his Earth security uniform the way a man wears a coat he has owned for so long that he no longer notices it. A Velithari aide, standing near the gallery rail, glanced at him and then turned to her colleague with a harmonic that translated roughly as, "The human is decorative at best," and her colleague responded with a soft chime of agreement. Elias heard the translation through his earpiece and said nothing, but his eyes moved steadily across the chamber below, tracking the positions of every Crethon soldier, and noting the way Drezik's tail twitched every time the Minari spoke, a pattern that Elias recognized from his training as a sign of predatory anticipation rather than boredom. He had memorized the full structural schematics of the arbitration nexus during his first week on station. All 417 decks, and 12,000 compartments, and every maintenance shaft and emergency exit, because that was what his instructors had drilled into him from the first day of basic training on Earth. And the lesson was simple and absolute, and it went like this: always know your exits, always know the terrain, always assume that the room you are sitting in might become the room you have to fight your way out of. Aliens found this kind of thinking paranoid and primitive. Elias found it kept him alive. The session ended without incident, and the delegations filed out through separate corridors as protocol demanded. And Salith remained on the dais for a long moment after the chamber had emptied, her crystalline skin flickering through shades of violet and amber that meant she was thinking hard about something that troubled her. Her senior aide approached and asked if something was wrong. "Drezik's arguments are designed to fail," Salith said quietly, and her harmonics carried a note of unease that made her aide take a step back, because in 300 years of service she had never heard the Arbitress sound uncertain about anything. "He does not want a ruling," Salith continued. "He wants the arbitration to collapse, and he wants it to look like it collapsed on its own, which means he is planning something that requires the absence of legal authority, and that frightens me more than any army he could bring through those doors." She turned to leave the chamber, and as she did, the lights flickered. Not a dramatic failure, not a blackout, just a brief and almost imperceptible dimming that lasted less than a second, the kind of thing that most people would dismiss as a minor power fluctuation on an ancient station. Salith did not dismiss it. She stopped walking, and her skin shifted to a deep and alarming red, the Velithari color of danger, and her harmonics dropped to a frequency so low that her aide felt it in her teeth rather than her ears. "Something is already happening," the Arbitress said, and somewhere deep in the station, a door opened that should have stayed sealed, and boots that did not belong to any authorized personnel hit the deck plating in the dark. The first explosion hit the communications array on Deck 12 and killed every long-range transmitter on the station in a single breath. And before the echo had faded, a second explosion tore through the primary security hub and turned 30 years of surveillance equipment into a cloud of sparking metal and burning wire. Salith felt it before she heard it, a shudder that ran through the ancient bones of the station like a heartbeat skipping, and she turned to her aide and said, "Seal the grand chamber." But the words had barely left her mouth when the doors of the chamber burst open, and Crethan soldiers poured through them like a river of scales and teeth and black armor. They were not the ceremonial delegation. These were combat troops, lean and fast and carrying weapons that hummed with the deep vibration of charged plasma, and they moved with the coordinated precision of soldiers who had rehearsed this exact assault 100 times in simulation before executing it. In reality, Warlord Drezik walked in behind them like a king entering a throne room he had just conquered, and his yellow eyes found Salith on the dais with the satisfied look of a predator that had finally cornered prey it had been stalking for months. "Arbitress," he said, and his voice was thick with a pleasure he did not bother to hide. "I hope you will forgive the interruption of proceedings." Salith stood her ground because that was what arbiters did. They stood their ground when the galaxy shook around them, and her crystalline skin burned with the deep red of danger, but her voice remained steady as she spoke. This is a violation of every treaty your dominion has ever signed, warlord, and the consequences will outlive your grandchildren." Drezek smiled, which on a Krathan face meant pulling back the lips to show 4 rows of serrated teeth, and he said, "There will be no consequences, Arbitress, because there will be no court to impose." He raised one clawed hand and signaled to a pair of soldiers who carried between them a long case made of black metal that was covered in symbols so old that even Salith did not recognize the language. And when they opened the case, the temperature in the chamber dropped by 10 degrees, and every psi-sensitive being within 100 meters felt a wave of nausea roll through their minds like a stone dropped into still water. Inside the case was a sword. It was not large, perhaps the length of a human arm, and its blade was made of a material that seemed to exist in more dimensions than 3, because looking at it directly made the eyes ache, and looking at it sideways revealed edges that should not have been geometrically possible. And it radiated a psychic presence so heavy and so old that it felt less like a weapon and more like a sleeping god. "A soul blade," Salith whispered, and for the first time in 600 years, her voice cracked, "had been forged 10,000 years ago by a species called the Vethian, who had since gone extinct. And they had been designed for a single purpose that was as elegant as it was cruel: to trap a living mind inside a cage of psionic energy, locking the victim's consciousness in an endless loop of psychic paralysis, while their body became a living statue, aware and screaming on the inside, but frozen and silent on the outside. And the blades had been banned by every civilized body in the galaxy for 3,000 years, because even the most warlike species agreed that there were some weapons that should never exist." Drezek lifted the soul blade from its case, and the chamber filled with a sound that was not a sound. A pressure that pushed against every mind in the room, like a hand pressing down on a skull. And the Menari delegates who had not yet fled collapsed into trembling heaps of light as their empathic networks overloaded. He walked to the dais, where Salith stood, drove the blade into the ancient stone at her feet. The effect was immediate and devastating. A cage of shimmering energy erupted from the blade and wrapped around Salith like a fist closing around a candle flame, and her crystalline body locked rigid with her eyes open and her mouth frozen mid-word, and her harmonic resonance collapsed into a single sustained note of pure agony that only psi-sensitive beings could hear, a scream without end that echoed through the psychic fabric of the station like a bell that would never stop ringing. The Arbitress was trapped, alive and conscious, and imprisoned inside her own mind, while the galaxy watched through the cameras that Drezek had deliberately left operational because he wanted everyone to see. He sat down in Salith's judicial chair and spread his arms wide and spoke to the cameras with the confidence of a man who had already won. "The arbitration nexus is under Krathan authority. The Arbitress is indisposed. Proceedings are suspended indefinitely, and any species that interferes will learn what the soul blade does to those who are not protected by 6 centuries of mental discipline." 3 decks below the Grand Chamber, Corporal Elias Wren was picking himself up off the floor of a service corridor where the first explosion had thrown him, and he was bleeding from a cut above his eye, and his ears were ringing, and the emergency lighting had switched to the dim red glow that meant the station was in crisis mode. A Minari empath named Typhus was crumpled against the wall beside him, their transparent body flickering with distressed patterns of white and gray, and they were clutching their head with 4 trembling appendages, because the psychic scream of the trapped Arbitress was tearing through every psi-sensitive mind on the station like a knife through paper. Elias knelt beside the Minari and checked them for injuries with the calm efficiency of a man who had been trained to perform first aid in conditions far worse than this, as he stabilized a fracture in one of their support limbs and propped them against the wall and said, "Can you hear me?" in the flat and steady voice he used when everything was going wrong. Typhus opened their eyes and stared at Elias, and for a moment the Minari forgot their pain entirely, because they were looking at something impossible. Every living being on the station was reacting to the Soul Blade's activation. Every species was staggering under the ambient psychic pressure that radiated from the weapon like heat from a sun. Even the non-psionic races were feeling headaches and disorientation from the sheer force of the blade's presence. Elias felt nothing. He was kneeling there with blood on his face and concern in his eyes, and his heart rate was elevated from the explosions and the adrenaline. But his mind was quiet and clear, and completely untouched by the psychic storm that was bringing every other being on the station to their knees. Typhus reached out with their empathic senses and tried to read the human, and what they found was like reaching for a stone in a river, and finding that the river simply flowed around the space where the stone should be. Because Elias's mind had no psionic architecture at all, no resonance frequency, no harmonic signature, no psychic footprint of any kind, and to the Soul Blade and everything like it, he was not resistant or shielded or protected. He was simply invisible, a ghost standing in plain sight in a world that could not see him. "You are silent," Typhus whispered through their pain, and their bioluminescence shifted to a color that meant awe mixed with terror. "The blade cannot hear you. It cannot find you. How is this possible? What are you?" Elias looked at the Minari, and then looked down the corridor, toward the distant sound of Crethon boots on metal, and the faint impossible note of an Arbitress screaming inside her own mind. And his brown eyes were very calm and very focused, and the answer he gave was simple. "I am the only one who can get to her," he said, and he stood up and checked the corridor in both directions and began to move. Inside the prison of the Soul Blade, the world was made of mirrors that reflected nothing true. Salith stood in a corridor that stretched in both directions without end, and the walls were made of her own memories twisted into shapes she did not recognize. Her first century of training warped into scenes of failure, her greatest rulings rewritten so that the guilty went free and the innocent were punished. And every door she opened led back to the same corridor, but slightly different, slightly worse, slightly more convincing in its lie that she had never been a good judge and never would be. The blade was old and patient, and it had done this before. It whispered to her in a voice that was not a voice, but a pressure, a weight on the mind that grew heavier with every passing minute. And it said things like, "You are not the first, and you will not be the last." 600 years of certainty, and look how easily it cracks. Surrender your name, and the pain will stop, and you will join the others who rest inside me. And you will never have to decide anything again. There were others in the blade, she could feel them, minds that had been trapped centuries ago, and had long since dissolved into echoes, fragments of identity that drifted through the psychic labyrinth like leaves on a river. And the blade wanted her to become one of them, to let go of the shape of herself and melt into the collection. She refused. She planted her feet on a floor that was not a floor, and drew on 6 centuries of disciplined thought, and said to the darkness, "I am Salith Vaughn, and I am the Arbitress of the Galactic Nexus, and I will not yield to a weapon that is older than me, but not wiser." And for a moment, the corridor flickered, and the mirrors cracked. But only for a moment, because the blade had held beings far older and far more powerful than a Velithari judge, and the cracks healed, and the corridor reformed, and the whispers grew louder. She was weakening, and she knew it. 3 decks below the grand chamber, Elias Wren moved through the darkness of the maintenance tunnels like a man who had been born in them. He had left Typhus in a secured compartment with instructions to stay hidden and stay quiet. And the Minari had gripped his arm before he left and said, "Be careful. The Crethan are not like fighting humans. They are faster and stronger. and their scales can turn a blade. And Elias had nodded and said, "I know," and had not said anything else because there was nothing else to say. The maintenance tunnels of the arbitration nexus were not designed for combat. They were designed for technicians who needed to reach power conduits and atmospheric processors, which meant they were narrow and dark, and full of pipes and cables that hung from the ceiling like the roots of metal trees. And Elias moved through them with a patience that was almost unnatural, stopping every few meters to listen, placing each foot with the deliberate care of a man who understood that one wrong sound would bring armored soldiers down on top of him. He encountered his first Crethan patrol at a junction where two tunnels crossed. There were two of them, both carrying plasma rifles, and both wearing the light reconnaissance armor that meant they were scouts sent to secure the lower decks. And they were talking to each other in the grunting, rapid-fire language of soldiers who were bored and confident, and did not expect trouble from the service corridors. Elias waited in the dark above them, wedged between two pipes, with his feet braced against the walls, and his body folded into a space that should not have been large enough for a grown man. And he waited until the first scout passed directly beneath him, and then he dropped. It was not elegant, and it was not pretty, and no one would ever make a training video out of it. But it was effective, and by the time the second scout realized what was happening, Elias had already used the first scout's own rifle strap to create leverage, and the fight was over in 8 seconds of brutal and desperate violence that left Elias with a bruised throat and a torn muscle in his left shoulder, and two unconscious Crethan on the tunnel floor. He took one of their communicators and listened to the chatter, and learned that Drezek had 40 soldiers on the station, and that they were positioned in 3 concentric rings around the grand chamber. And he filed that information away the same way he filed away everything, quietly and completely, in a mind that processed tactical data the way other people processed breathing. Typhus was monitoring his progress through the station's internal sensors, which the Crethan had not thought to disable, because they had not thought anyone would be moving through the maintenance levels. And the Minari empath was also monitoring Elias's emotional state through the faint empathic connection they had established when they first touched. What Typhus felt from the human was something the Minari had never encountered in any species across 300 years of empathic contact. Elias was afraid. His heart was beating fast, and his adrenal glands were flooding his blood with chemicals that screamed at every cell in his body to run, to hide, to get as far from the danger as possible. And his hands were shaking with a fine tremor that he controlled through deliberate effort. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice was telling him that he was one man against 40, and that this was insane, and that he was going to die in a dark tunnel on a station that was not his home, for a species that had mocked him since the day he arrived. And none of it mattered, because alongside the fear, there was something else, something that Typhus could not name, because the Minari had no word for it. A quality of mind that took the fear and acknowledged it, and set it aside on a shelf, like a book that could be read later, and then turned its full attention to the next step, and the step after that, and the step after that, not suppressing the terror, but simply refusing to let it make the decisions. Typhus had studied the psychic profiles of over 200 species, and in every single one of them, fear was either a force that overwhelmed rational thought, or a force that was neutralized through psychic discipline before it could take hold. And the Minari had always believed that these were the only two options available to conscious minds. Humans did neither. They carried the fear inside them, like a fire in a lantern, burning and real and painful. And they walked forward anyway, not because they could not feel it, but because they had decided that feeling it was not a good enough reason to stop. Elias reached the outer ring of Crethan guards, and he did not have a weapon, because the plasma rifles were keyed to Crethan biology and would not fire for human hands. So he had a maintenance tool that was essentially a heavy wrench and a length of cable he had pulled from a wall panel. and a plan that no sane tactician in the galaxy would have approved it. He took out the first guard by dropping a fire suppression canister from an overhead vent, and using the cloud of chemical foam as cover to close the distance. And he took out the second guard by jamming the maintenance tool into the gap between the soldier's helmet and neck armor, with enough force to crack the seal and send compressed atmosphere hissing into the Crethan's face. The third guard was bigger than the others, and faster, and this fight was not quick or efficient. It was ugly and painful, and it ended with Elias pinned against a blast door, with the Crethan's claws around his throat, and his vision going dark at the edges. And he won only because he managed to loop the cable around the soldier's arm, and use his own body weight as a counterbalance to throw the Crethan off balance. And then he did not stop hitting until the soldier stopped moving. He sat against the wall afterward, and breathed in short, ragged gasps, and his hands were shaking badly now, and the torn muscle in his shoulder was screaming, and there was blood on his face that was both his and not his. And he gave himself exactly 30 seconds to feel all of it before he stood up and kept moving. Typhus watched through the sensors, and then opened a channel to the other Minari who were hiding throughout the station, and transmitted a message that was part warning and part wonder. "I understand now why the galaxy should not have dismissed the humans," the empath said, and their bioluminescence burned with a color that none of the other Minari had ever seen before. "They do not fight because they are unafraid. They fight because they have decided that fear is not a reason to stop. And I do not know if that makes them brave or insane. Know that it makes them dangerous in a way that none of us ever imagined." Elias reached the final blast door that separated the maintenance level from the grand chamber corridor, and beyond it he could hear the hum of the soul blade, and the distant sound of Crethan voices, and the faint impossible note of Salith screaming inside her own mind. He had no weapons and no backup, and his body was battered and bleeding, and the odds against him were the kind of odds that military textbooks used as examples of situations where retreat was the only rational option. He took one breath, and then another, and then he pushed the door open and walked through it. The grand chamber was bathed in the sick light of the soul blade, a shifting glow that was not quite purple and not quite black, and that made the ancient stone walls look like they were breathing. And in the center of the dais, Salith stood frozen with her eyes open, and her mouth caught in the shape of a word she would never finish, and her crystalline skin locked in a shade of red so deep it was almost black. Warlord Dresic sat in the Arbitress's chair, with one leg thrown over the armrest, like a man lounging in his own living room. And around the chamber, 12 of his elite guards stood at attention, with weapons drawn, and scales gleaming under the psionic light, and the broadcast cameras mounted on the upper walls were still recording, because Dresic wanted every civilization in the galaxy to see that the age of arbitration was over. The chamber doors opened, and Elias Wren walked in. He was not an impressive sight by any standard that the galaxy would recognize. Human of average height and average build, with blood drying on his face, and one arm held slightly closer to his body than the other, because of the torn muscle in his shoulder. And his uniform was ripped and stained, and his hands were empty, and his expression was the kind of calm that could easily be mistaken for stupidity by anyone who did not know what they were looking at. Dresic looked at him and laughed. It was a genuine laugh, not a performance, the kind of laugh that comes from encountering something so absurd that the body responds before the mind can catch up. And several of his elite guard joined in, because the sight of a single wounded human walking unarmed into a room full of Crethan warriors was the funniest thing any of them had seen since the invasion began. "A human," Dresic said, and his yellow eyes were bright with amusement. "The galaxy sends a human. I could not have written a better joke if I had spent a year trying." Elias did not look at Dresic. He did not look at the guards or the cameras or the weapons pointed at him from every angle. and he did not slow down or speed up, or change the direction of his walking in any way, because from the moment he entered the chamber, his eyes were fixed on one thing, and one thing only, and that was the soul blade embedded in the dais at Salit's feet, and the frozen Arbitress trapped behind its light. He walked toward her the way a man walks toward something he has decided to do, not fast and not slow, but steady and certain. The walk of someone who has already calculated the cost and accepted it. Drezek stopped laughing. "Halt," the warlord said, and his voice shifted from amusement to command, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, because something about the way the human was walking made the scales on the back of his neck rise in a way he had not felt since the last time he had faced something on a battlefield that he did not understand. Did not halt. Two of the elite guard moved to intercept him, and the first one swung a heavy armored fist that caught Elias in the side and sent him stumbling 3 steps to the left, and the second one drove a knee into his midsection that folded him in half and dropped him to one knee with a sound that was mostly air leaving his lungs and partly the crack of something in his ribcage giving way. Elias got up. He got up the way humans always get up, not gracefully and not quickly, but with a grinding, stubborn refusal to accept that the ground was where he belonged. And he straightened his back and took a breath that hurt, and kept walking toward the dais. Drezek stood from the chair. "What are you doing?" the warlord demanded, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before, something that sounded almost like concern, because the human was 10 meters from the soul blade, and every other being who had come within 20 meters of the weapon had been brought to their knees by the ambient psionic pressure, and this human was walking through it like it was not there. Because for Elias, it was not there. The soul blade radiated psionic energy the way a star radiates light, and that energy pressed against the minds of every living thing in range, and found the psychic architecture of their consciousness, and squeezed. But when it reached for Elias, it found nothing to squeeze, because the human mind was built on a foundation of electrochemical signals and chaotic neural patterns that had no psionic structure at all, no resonance frequency to lock onto, and no harmonic signature to disrupt, and no psychic shape to cage. To the most powerful psychic weapon ever created by any civilization in the history of the galaxy, Elias Wren was not shielded, he was not resistant, he was not protected by any technology or training or biological adaptation. He was invisible. He was a gap in the fabric of psychic reality, whole, shaped like a man, and the blade could not see him any more than a net can catch the wind. Elias reached the dais, and he looked at Salit's frozen face, and he could see that her eyes were still alive behind the paralysis, still aware, still conscious, still screaming in a prison that no one else could reach. And something in his expression changed, in a way that the cameras caught, and the galaxy would later watch 1,000,000,000 times over. It was not rage, and it was not determination, and it was not heroism in the way that any alien species understood the word. It was simply a decision. He reached out and grabbed the soul blade with both hands. The blade screamed. Not a sound that traveled through air, but a psychic shockwave that erupted from the weapon like a bomb going off inside the mind of every psi-sensitive being on the station. A shriek of something that was 10,000 years old, encountering for the first time in its existence a thing it could not comprehend, and the Crethon guards staggered, and Drezek fell back against the chair, and across the station beings of every species clutched their heads, as the scream ripped through the psychic fabric of the Nexus like a blade through silk. The sword fought him. It poured psionic energy into his hands, and tried to find his mind and lock it down the way it had locked down gods and emperors and warlords for 100 centuries, and it could not find him. It reached and reached and reached and found nothing but smoke and chaos, and a pattern of consciousness so alien to its design that it might as well have been trying to imprison a thunderstorm. But the energy had to go somewhere, and what it could not direct into his mind, it redirected into his body. And Elias felt his hands begin to burn as the psionic force manifested as physical resistance, as heat and pressure, and a weight that felt like trying to pull a mountain out of the ground by its roots. And the muscles in his arms screamed, and the bones in his fingers groaned, and blood began to run from his nose and his ears, as the sheer neurological feedback of holding something that existed in more dimensions than his body was designed to handle tore at the edges of his nervous system. He did not let go. His grip tightened, and his teeth clenched, and his legs braced against the dais, and he pulled, and the blade fought him with everything it had, 10,000 years of accumulated psychic force, focused on a single pair of human hands that would not release their hold. Inside the prison, Salith felt the world shake. The corridor of mirrors that had been her cage for what felt like an eternity shuddered and cracked, and through the cracks she could feel something gripping the blade from the outside, something that the weapon could not identify or categorize or defend against. And for the first time in its ancient existence, the semi-sentient mind of the Soul Blade was experiencing an emotion it had never known. Confusion. What was holding it, and how was it holding it, and why could it not see the shape of the mind that refused to let go? And the blade's attention split between maintaining its prison and trying to understand the impossible thing that was pulling at it from outside. And in that moment of divided focus, the walls of Salith's cage cracked wide open. She did not hesitate. 600 years of judicial discipline and mental training compressed into a single act of will, as she drove her consciousness into the cracks, like a hammer into a fracture line, and the prison shattered around her in a cascade of breaking light, and the echoes of every mind the blade had ever trapped surged toward the opening she had made, and poured through it like water through a broken dam. Elias ripped the soul blade free from the dais with a sound that was half a scream and half a roar, and entirely human. And the psionic cage around Salith collapsed, a house made of glass hit by a stone, and her crystalline body blazed with light so bright that every being in the chamber shielded their eyes as 6 centuries of consciousness flooded back into a form that had been frozen for what felt like forever. The soul blade clattered from Elias's hands and skidded across the stone floor, inert and dark and silent for the first time in 10,000 years. And Elias dropped to his knees because his body had given everything it had and there was nothing left. And his hands were blackened and nerveless, and his vision was fading at the edges, and he could taste copper in the back of his throat. Salith drew her first breath as a free mind, and it sounded like the beginning of something. She rose from the dais, and her crystalline skin shifted through every color the Velithari spectrum could produce, before settling on a white so pure and so bright that it hurt to look at, the color that the ancient texts called the light of absolute authority, a color that had not been seen in 3,000 years. She turned to face Drezek. The warlord took a step backward, and then another, because the thing standing on the dais was no longer a judge sitting behind a desk weighing arguments with careful neutrality. It was the living embodiment of a legal system that had held the galaxy together for 4 millennia, and it had just been imprisoned and tortured and freed by the bare hands of a species the galaxy had dismissed as children. And it was angry in the way that justice is angry when it has been violated. Her harmonic resonance dropped to a single frequency that struck every Krethan in the chamber like a physical blow. The ancient Velithari tone of absolute and irrevocable judgment that carried the weight of every treaty and every law and every ruling that her species had ever rendered. She spoke one word in the old judicial language, a word that had not been spoken aloud in living memory. Being in the galaxy, watching the broadcast, understood its meaning without translation, because some words are older than language itself. Guilty. The surrender happened faster than the invasion. Drezek's soldiers laid down their weapons within minutes of the Arbitress's judgment, because the broadcast had gone out to every corner of civilized space, and every species that had ever signed a treaty under Velethari authority was watching. And the Crethon Dominion's own High Council transmitted a disavowal of Warlord Drezek before the last of his soldiers had even put their rifles on the ground, offering him up to the arbitration nexus for trial, with a speed that suggested they had been preparing for the possibility of his failure all along. The Minari territory in the Outer Veil was secured by emergency ruling within the hour, and the Crethon Dominion accepted sanctions that would limit their military expansion for a generation. And Salith presided over every decision from the dais of the Grand Chamber, with the white light of absolute authority still burning in her crystalline skin, and her harmonics carrying a gravity that made even the most powerful delegations speak softly and choose their words with care. Justice was restored, and the galaxy exhaled. But the thing that the galaxy could not stop talking about was not the ruling, or the sanctions, or the fate of Warlord Drezek, who would spend the rest of his life in a Velethari rehabilitation facility, learning what it meant to be held accountable for the suffering he had caused. The thing the galaxy could not stop talking about was the human. The footage of Elias Wren walking across the Grand Chamber and grabbing the soul blade with his bare hands was broadcast and rebroadcast and analyzed and debated on every inhabited world in known space. And within a day, it had been viewed more times than any single piece of media in galactic history. And the arguments about what it meant and how it was possible and what it said about the species called humanity filled academic journals and military briefings and late-night discussion. Programs on 1,000 different planets. The Velethari Psionic Institute published a landmark paper within a week, and its findings sent shockwaves through every field of study that touched on consciousness and the nature of the mind. Human brains, the paper explained, had evolved on a world without any ambient psionic field, a statistical rarity so extreme that most xenobiologists had not even considered it as a variable in their models. And as a result, the human mind had developed along entirely electrochemical lines, with no psionic architecture whatsoever, no resonance frequency, and no harmonic signature, and no psychic footprint of any kind, which meant that to any psionic phenomenon in the galaxy, from the gentlest empathic scan to the most powerful psychic weapon ever created, a human mind was functionally invisible. The paper called it cognitive dark matter, and the name stuck. Humanity was not psi-resistant, the paper emphasized, because resistance implied a force pushing back against another force, and humans were not pushing back against anything. They simply existed in a dimension of consciousness that psionic energy could not reach. Like a fish trying to grab a bird, the two systems operated in fundamentally incompatible domains, and no amount of psionic force would ever bridge the gap. The implications were staggering. Every species in the galaxy had spent millennia developing psionic defenses, because psionic warfare was the most devastating and the most feared form of combat in existence. And now there was a species that was immune to all of it, not through technology or training or genetic engineering, but through the simple accident of having evolved on a quiet world where the psionic spectrum had never existed. Elias did not read the paper or watch the broadcasts or follow the debates, because Elias was in a medical bay having his hands repaired by a team of Velethari surgeons and human doctors who had been brought in via emergency transit from Earth, and the work was delicate and slow, because the psionic feedback from the soul blade had caused nerve damage that neither species had ever seen before. A kind of injury that existed at the intersection of physics and metaphysics, and required both medical traditions working together to heal. Salith visited him on the third day. She entered the medical bay alone, without aides or guards, and her crystalline skin had settled from the blinding white of authority back to the deep sapphire of calm thought, and she stood at the foot of his bed and looked at him for a long time, without speaking. her harmonics cycling through frequencies so complex that even her own species would have struggled to interpret them. Elias looked back at her with the same quiet brown eyes that had watched from the gallery a lifetime ago, and if he was uncomfortable being studied by a 600-year-old alien judge, he did not show it. "I was aware," said at last, and her voice carried a harmonic that meant she was choosing her words with extreme care. "Inside the prison, I felt the moment something gripped the blade from outside, and I felt the blade's confusion, its inability to understand what was touching it, because in 10,000 years of existence, it had never encountered a mind it could not see." She paused, and her skin flickered with amber, the color of a question being formed. "How did it feel," she asked, "to hold something that was never meant to be held?" Elias thought about it for a moment, genuinely considered the question the way he considered every question that was worth answering honestly, and then he said, "It felt like holding on to something that really did not want to be held, so I just did not let go." Salith studied him for another long moment, and then she made a sound that Elias had never heard from a Velithari before, a soft harmonic that resonated somewhere between laughter and something much deeper and much older than laughter, something like recognition. "In 600 years of arbitration, I have seen every kind of strength the galaxy has to offer," she said. "I have seen species that could shatter planets with their psionic abilities, and species that could rewrite the fundamental forces of nature, and species that had conquered death itself and made their civilizations immortal. And I have never seen anything like what you did. Not because it was the most powerful thing I have witnessed, but because it was by every metric the galaxy uses to measure strength, completely impossible. And you did it anyway." She moved closer, and her harmonics dropped to a private frequency that was meant for his ears alone. "Why?" she asked, and her crystalline eyes held his with an intensity that 6 centuries of judicial authority had sharpened into something that could cut through any pretense. "Why did you walk into that chamber? You had no guarantee that your immunity would protect you from the blade's physical effects. You had every reason to believe it would kill you. You were alone, and wounded, and outnumbered, and no one had asked you to go, and no one would have blamed you for staying hidden. So why?" Elias was quiet for a long time. The medical bay hummed softly around them, and the light from Salith's crystalline skin painted gentle blue patterns on the walls. And somewhere beyond the station, the ancient red star continued its slow death. And in the silence, Elias flexed his bandaged hands, and winced, and then looked up at the Arbitress with an expression that contained nothing complicated and nothing hidden. "Because you were still in there," he said, "and someone had to try." Salith did not respond immediately, and the harmonics that came from her in the silence were so layered and so deep that they would later be analyzed by Velithari musicologists, who would conclude that the Arbitress had expressed in that moment an emotion so complex that their language did not have a single word for it, only a phrase that translated roughly as the recognition of a kind of nobility that one did not expect to find, and is grateful to have witnessed. 2 weeks later, the Galactic Council convened an emergency summit to discuss the implications of the Soul Blade incident and humanity's newly revealed psionic immunity, and representatives from over 60 species gathered in the restored Grand Chamber of the Arbitration Nexus, and the air was thick with expectation, because every analyst and every strategist and every political commentator in the galaxy had been predicting that humanity would leverage this biological advantage for political power. The human ambassador rose to speak, a woman named Adiez Okafor, who had been born in Lagos and raised on a space station, and who carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from representing a species that has spent its entire galactic existence being underestimated. "We are aware," she said, and her voice was clear and steady and carried to every corner of the silent chamber, "of what the galaxy now believes about our species, and we are aware that many of you expect us to use this revelation as leverage, to demand concessions or expand our influence or position ourselves as the galaxy's answer to psionic warfare. She paused and looked around the chamber. And then she said something that the galaxy would remember for a very long time. We are not interested in being feared. We did not come to the stars to find new ways to be powerful. We came because we looked up at the night sky and wanted to know who else was out there, and whether they might want to talk to us. And if our unique neurology can protect others, the way Corporal Wren protected Arbitress Vaughn, then we offer that gift freely, not as a bargaining chip and not as a weapon, but as a hand extended in the hope that someone will take. The chamber was silent for a long moment, and then Arbitress Saywyth Vaughn did something that no Velithari Arbitress had done in recorded history. She rose from the judicial bench and descended the steps to the chamber floor, and stood before the human delegation, and she bowed. Not a bow of submission or of deference, but a bow of recognition, one equal acknowledging another, a gesture that carried the weight of 4,000 years of Velithari judicial tradition, and that said more clearly than any words could have expressed, that the age of humanity being treated as children was over. The galaxy had always measured strength in resonance, in psionic power, in the ability to reach into the minds of others and bend them to your will. And for 10,000 years, the greatest expression of that strength had been the Soul Blade, a weapon designed to trap gods. Humanity offered a different definition. Strength was not the ability to overpower. It was not immunity, or invincibility, or the absence of fear. It was the willingness to hold on through pain and terror and impossible odds, for no other reason than because someone needed you to. It was the decision to walk into a room you might not walk out of, because a person you barely knew was suffering, and you could not stand by and let it continue. The Soul Blade was locked in a vault deep beneath the Nexus, inert and silent for the first time in 10,000 years. And the minds it had trapped were free, and the weapon that had been designed to imprison gods had finally met something it was never built to comprehend. Something as stubborn and irrational and beautifully relentless as a human being who had decided that letting go was not an option. And in the quiet of his recovery room, with the summit broadcast playing softly on a screen he was not watching, Corporal Elias Wren flexed his bandaged hands and winced, and looked up at the nurse who was changing his dressings, and asked in a voice that was perfectly serious whether the station cafeteria had any coffee.